A shocking twist in a case of a woman who admitted to brutally murdering a New York City antique dealer. 28-year-old Alex Ray Scott has been behind bars since January of 2020 for the murder of 64-year-old Kenneth Savinski. At the time of her arrest, Scott identified as a man but has since transitioned to female while in jail. According to police, Scott met Savinski on a dating app, and on the same day of meeting the antique dealer, Scott attacked and murdered him. Prosecutors say the victim thought the two were meeting for a romantic liaison, but Scott thought it would be an opportunity to rob and attack him. Prosecutors say Scott stabbed him in the face and neck, severing an artery, and then strangled him to death. Then Scott swiped the victim's watch, credit cards, and cash. About 2 hours after Scott reportedly was seen going into the victim's apartment, she left the apartment and was seen on surveillance video wearing the victim's jacket and counting cash. Then used that money and the victim's credit cards to buy food, new clothes, and cab rides. A couple days after the murder, Scott reportedly walked into an NYPD precinct with Savinski's credit cards and ID, said she didn't remember the past few days but thinks she may have killed someone. She reportedly told investigators she had been drinking for a few days and couldn't recall the gruesome attack, or where she left her car, or the name of the hotel she'd been staying, but remembered buying bandages for her hands. She told detectives she did remember various details of the rest of the day, like buying things to eat and having conversations with other people. According to the indictment obtained by the New York Post, Scott told detectives, "I woke up this morning in a Jersey City hotel with another person's ID and credit cards." She said she Googled Savinski's name and address and saw that he was killed. She reportedly told officers, "I think I killed someone. I have cuts on my hands, so it has to be me because that's the only thing that makes sense." And when investigators looked more into Scott, it was revealed at the time there was a warrant out for Scott's arrest back in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where she had faced charges for molesting a 5-year-old boy in September of 2018. According to reports, Scott first arrived to New York City during the fall of 2018 after the molestation allegations surfaced, then drove more than 1,000 miles to Long Island, where she was spotted by East Hampton police and was arrested in October of that year on a warrant for the charges. She told police at the time she was driving to Montauk to commit suicide. Scott was brought back to Tulsa and pleaded not guilty and was jailed for about 8 months before managing to post bail. She was reportedly released with an ankle bracelet under the condition she was to report back to court weekly. After authorities noticed she had missed several check-ins, another warrant was issued for Scott's arrest, just 8 days before Savinski was found dead. But this year, another shocking twist. When it was revealed in court, Scott murdered another man and decapitated him with a chainsaw. She reportedly admitted to that horrific crime after her 2020 arrest, but the details surfaced while she appeared in court on Monday, when she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and multiple counts of criminal possession in Savinski's death. According to prosecutors, when Scott walked into the NYPD precinct to confess to Savinski's death, she admitted then to killing someone else, but in her home state of Oklahoma. She told law enforcement then she was a previous resident in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and mentioned she had lived with the victim. Authorities tried to contact the victim, who was identified as 63-year-old Robin Skocdopole. In February of 2020, Broken Arrow PD searched his residence, only to find a house empty of all possessions. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office, forensic searches and cadaver dogs found multiple locations of blood spatter and a large pool of blood. The DNA matched the blood to Skocdopole. Then a few months later, human remains matching the 63-year-old were discovered on the edge of a creek. And according to the medical examiner, 2 different saws were used during the dismemberment of his body, including a chainsaw. Authorities say Skocdopole was last seen alive in August of 2019. Scott was renting a room from the victim and told others that Skocdopole abruptly left and moved to Dallas, Texas for work. Friends of the victim told authorities when they tried to reach him, they received vague and oddly worded responses. When officials ran analysis on Scott's ankle monitor, the data showed Scott traveled to dispose of his body parts. And Scott's ankle monitor data and bank history confirmed she purchased and returned a chainsaw to a local retailer. By May of 2023, she agreed to be interviewed by the FBI and agreed to take the FBI to the last known location of Skocdopole's head. But when they arrived to the location, no additional remains were found. I'm joined now by retired NYPD Detective Sergeant Dan Murphy. Dan, thanks so much for being here. There's so many different layers to this story. We have Alex Scott, who pleaded guilty to murdering a New York City antique dealer. Scott was on the run, accused of molesting a 5-year-old. Then on top of that, it was discovered Scott also decapitated her 63-year-old roommate. What are your thoughts on this story?
This is an individual with some obvious mental health issues and probably some substance abuse issues as well. I find it very telling that Alex chose to hold on to credit cards that she stole during or after the homicide in Oklahoma. And the same thing was missing from the residence in Manhattan during the 2020 homicide there. It's very telling indeed. And it's almost as though sometimes criminals want to leave a bread trail. And I've seen that myself before. They're holding on to something that incriminates them. I find that fascinating. This is an individual who runs the gamut in terms of illness, mentally, probably, and um, the capacity for violence is extreme. This is not even just a one and done. These are gruesome crime scenes.
And what do you make of Scott just walking into an NYPD precinct to confess to murder during your time as a detective? Did you ever see something like that even happen?
Yes, there have been people who have walked in. Historically, it is not uncommon. It's far more common that they will work to evade you as long as possible. But there are people who, for a variety of reasons, will come in. And I can only theorize as to what that reason might be. There's a couple of them. For people who have consciences, sometimes, and I don't know that that's the case here, sometimes the conscience weighs down so heavily on them that they desperately need to get the story out. And you'll find them sleeping in a cell right after they do that. It's a fascinating phenomenon.
And are you surprised that Alex Scott was able to flee the state of Oklahoma not once, but twice to go to New York? First, after being released on bail on the molestation charge, then again after being placed on an ankle monitor.
It's not uncommon for people to be able to evade ankle monitor. It's all up to the response of the agencies involved. And it's an imperfect world when it comes to that. There's a lot of people out there wanted for crimes who are wearing monitors, people who have been convicted, people awaiting trial, etc. And keeping track of all of them can be very difficult. It's not as difficult to get away as one would think.
And do you think that had authorities been aware of or have known that Alex Scott missed those court appointed appointments, that they had noticed, like, oh, maybe that could have prevented the murder of Kenneth here in New York City?
Well, I think hindsight really does give you a great advantage. At the moment, as I just mentioned before, the capacity of the agencies involved to follow up as quickly as possible on these cases, um, I think that's what's really at play here as to whether or not they have the staffing and the capability. And what someone does when they're out is entirely up to them. It's hard to predict. It really is.
As far as just kind of the motives for these crimes, because they're just absolutely shocking, do you think money was kind of the motive here? Or do you think that in a way, Alex Scott kind of had a thrill for these types of acts of violence?
I think there's a variety of reasons why Alex Scott did these two crimes that we know of. There may even be more, and I think not the least of that is the financial gain. Of course, take credit cards, took whatever else there was of value in these apartments, but you don't need to kill someone to get a few $1,000s. There's got to be some reason why. It's got to be the lure and the attraction of the feeling of power and control, um, a desire to lash out against people who you may perceive as being responsible for whatever it is that bothers you or haunts you in life. I mean, to see inside this person's mind would be fascinating, but you do not have to kill people to get a couple $1,000s as a criminal. So I doubt that would be the sole motivation.
And let's turn to the murder of Robin Skocdopole. Murdering someone you live with, dismembering their body with a chainsaw, again, just such a horrific manner. Then just telling people that Robin abruptly left to go to Dallas. What are your thoughts on that case, given just, again, the severity and the gruesomeness of just murdering someone so coldly and using a chainsaw and then just scattering pieces of their body in a wooded area in Oklahoma? What are your thoughts?
It just reeks of stone cold sociopathic murder. This is a person who does not feel for anyone but themselves. This is a person who the thrill of not just killing, but of completely insulting the body satisfies something within them. And to do a crime like that, to me, does not appear to be a one off. I think that a deeper look into Alex Scott's background and travels and movements will probably find more along these lines. I could be wrong, but this is not something a first timer does.
And kind of going off of that, do you think that this was a cold, calculated, premeditated murder in both of these cases? Or do you think that this was just kind of, in both instances, crimes of opportunity?
I think it was probably premeditated and maybe very much so. Having a chainsaw available is not something that you have in the house at any given moment necessarily. If you need it and you use it regularly, that's one thing. But to do what they did, if it was something that just happened on a spur of the moment, you probably would be shocked at your own actions immediately as you're doing it and right afterwards, and maybe work to repair that situation, call an ambulance, feel terrible about it, etc. But to go as far as to completely decapitate and remove body parts and then spread them around, this required some thought in advance. This required some built up and pent up emotions and feelings. So I have a feeling it was not an act that was a spur of the moment. And the second one, having done the first one already in Oklahoma, now, and the New York one was the more common one, I believe. I'm sorry, more recent one. Having done that one, now you've already crossed the bridge into when you're really upset about something. This is what you do. Now, this is a person that Alex Scott lured through a dating site, met, and for whatever reason during the course of that meeting, decided to kill this person. And it possibly could have been a complete setup from the very beginning, or this person said or did something that triggered this anger and violence in them. We won't know till we hear statements or perhaps read blogs or text messaging or learn more about Alex Scott. But for right now, I have a feeling this was not just a reaction to a moment's worth of anger.
And I also think it was interesting that both of the victims in the murder cases were older than Scott was. Scott's still in her 20s, whereas the victims were in their 60s and older. What are your thoughts also about just kind of the age difference as far as maybe Scott thought in a way that she could get away with these types of heinous crimes? What are your thoughts?
Well, it could be there's something psychologically there about a parent and a father specifically. Could be revenge against that. It could be that older people tend to be more accomplished, perhaps, and have more money and more assets. Um, I really don't know. There's got to be so much psychologically going on here that it would be fascinating to read the results of any examination that are done by professionals.
Under Scott's plea agreement, she was to tell the FBI where Skocdopole's head was, but then nothing turned up. Are you surprised? And are you surprised Scott was even given a deal in this case?
You know, the behind the scenes discussions between the prosecutors and the defense in conjunction with the judge sometimes can seem weird to those of us on the outside. They can seem strange, or why would you do that? But there may be a very, very sincere and good and solid reason for doing that. Um, the family may so desperately want to recover as much of the body that they're willing to tell the prosecutors, I'm okay with this person getting a little bit of a break if I can bury my loved one. And that may be the motivating factor in this. But it's also not uncommon for people to listen. They'll come in, they'll want to be listened to by authorities to get attention, to get special meals, to get taken out in a car, to go to look at locations, and in reality have no desire whatsoever to tell you what they did with it, or potentially not even remember what they did with it or where it is. So this could all be a charade on Scott's part.
Well, great insight from you, Dan Murphy. I really appreciate your time today. Before we sign you off, is there anything else about this case that you would like to add?
I think that further investigation is warranted. I think that, and maybe it has been done. I think this individual is not a first timer to the world of violence, not a first timer to the world of luring people into relationships or rendezvous and then taking advantage of them. And it may just be nonviolent thefts, but these two are obviously very extreme ones. But the taking of the credit cards and the using of them is very telling. That's one of the MOs involved here. And so I have a feeling it was done more than once, more than twice that we know of.
All right. Well, Dan Murphy, again, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime, Elizabeth. Thank you.
According to reports, under Alex Scott's plea deal, she will serve 22 years to life in prison for the murder of Kenneth Savinski. If she's released, she'll be sent to Oklahoma to serve out her 45-year sentence for Robin Skocdopole's murder. She's due back in court again on September 26th for her formal sentencing. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.